Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Good morning and welcome to the ifxexpo Asia 2024. I wish you all a very productive next couple of days. My name is Stathis Kyriakides and I am with FXGT.com. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay, thank you. All right. For those of you who are not familiar with FXGT.com, we are an award-winning financial service provider with a presence across many regions. The company was established on a vision of transforming customer experience and enabling our partners in achieving their goals. As we grow, we remain focused on delivering value and building trust with our partners across the globe. A little bit about myself. Before joining FXGT.com, I had the chance to work in a number of sectors in finance. This included credit ratings, fintech services, consulting, and some lobbying. During that time, I had the opportunity, I had the luck to meet Rory Keelan, who's sitting here with me, and who's honoring us with his presence. Now, as you know, and I'll change the slide up there, and as it says on the slide up there, Rory is the brother of Brian Keelan, one of the fathers of CFDs, and he's honoring us with his presence here to discuss the impact and of his brother Brian. Now, I've known Rory for the last 20 years, something like that, yes. And I have had the chance to discuss with him the things that we're going to be talking about today many times. I've been very privileged in that regard, and I've probably forgotten most things than I can actually remember. But there's not going to be enough time to discuss all the things that Brian has done throughout his life. So what we're going to try to focus on is give you a sense of how Brian would approach things, how he operated, and at the end of the day, what drove his capacity to innovate. During our discussion, we're also going to be projecting some quotes of things that were said about Brian in the past, and the way that these were actually reported in UK newspapers. There's a story behind each one of those quotes, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to touch on all of them because of the shortness of time. But I am going to try to make it up to you towards the end of this discussion. So bear with us and allow me to go back on script in order to actually finish with the introductions, and then so that we can allow Rory to tell us more about his brother. So a little bit about Rory. He studied at Cambridge and he has built a very interesting and varied career. He started in merchant banking at Kleinwort Benson before taking on roles at Bank of America in the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, and London. He spent 12 years at Abu Dhabi National Bank and later became the CEO of Pulsar Knowledge Center in India. More recently, Rory has been using his deep experience as a ratings analyst. As we said, the conversation today is not just about Rory, it's also about Brian Keelan. Brian also studied at Oxford, and he started his career at Credit Suisse Wide Wealth. He then moved on to Hill Samuel and Merrill Lynch before making his mark at Swiss Bank Corporation. It was there that he led some groundbreaking transactions that, among others, revolutionized the use of CFDs. By the way, I'd like to point out that Brian became known for CFDs later on, but he was very well known in the city for a number of other transactions that he he led during his time, especially at the SBC. Now, after many years as SBC, and long after it had merged with UBS, Brian transitioned to Jardine Madison in Hong Kong, where he served as group strategy director and was on the board of several group companies until his passing. Brian was one of those people that did not just contribute to the evolution of the industry, he redefined it. Okay? He revolutionized it. Okay? And it's on what we're going to try to do today is try to understand who this guy was and the way that he approached things in order to be able to innovate. So I'm honored to sit here today with Rory to explore Brian's remarkable contribution, the lasting impact of his work. So without further ado, welcome, Rory. Thank you for accepting the invitation. And
good morning, everyone. Accepting the invitation was fairly easy in that my wife lives in Bangkok, so it's a great chance to come and visit. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm only staying briefly in the hotel, so I have a home here. To explain what drove Brian early is remember that we had very parallel careers, sibling rivalry. I'd gone into what was then merchant banking, became investment banking. Brian did the same. I'd gone to Cambridge, he went to Oxford. At every stage, he excelled. At every stage, he had excelled and way past me, but it didn't really dawn on him for about the first 10 years. What made Brian different, even at university and shortly after, is he had a supreme self-confidence, but also backed that up with his ability to confront tasks and problems from the base essentials. He was not interested in applying a solution out of an existing box. He wanted to find out what the problem was, and he would find out what the problem was by talking to the client and not really asking the client the problem. Well, he would ask that, but then he would try and find out whether the client really understood the problem or not. Then when Brian was sure he knew what the problem was, he would break it down into elements and come up to solve each piece and then put it all together at the end for a solution.
This was, to an extent, what also led to the development of CFDs, right?
It is, but also what was important is that he had the self-confidence as a relatively junior employee early on to basically go into a room of very senior people and not only participate in the discussion, at times he would end up leading the discussion. In one case, when he was fairly junior in his career at CS White Weld, he was in a meeting where he was the most junior in the room, and a telephone kept on ringing, and they couldn't get it to stop. It was a problem. So Brian just got a hold of a pair of scissors, cut the cord, said, "Now can we begin the meeting?" And carried on. It could have got him fired. In fact, it got him noticed, and that started him on the way up there. His moves on to Hill Samuel was error. His move to Merrill Lynch was on a promotion and a pay package, but he never got on with the Americans because he found that American houses were tended to want to sell their clients an existing solution. Brian was not interested. You know, they were off the rail buying a suit. They may be Brooks Brothers, but it was off the rail. Brian was made to measure. So it's what the client needed, not what his bank wanted to sell.
Actually, this is something that I find very interesting, and because we are talking about innovation to an extent, and it seems like Brian was one of those guys that would make space for himself in order to innovate, but at the same time, he needed that space and he would look for it. So even with the companies that he chose to work for, this was one of the things that he was looking for. And obviously, I mean, we would all like to replicate things that Brian's were doing, achieved. But I mean, this is not something that anybody can do. What we can do sometimes is be able to allow the space and identify people that might be able to innovate like that and provide that space for these people. But it's also very important to try to make the space for ourselves. And this is what I understand Brian was doing.
Yeah, he was fortunate that he ended up with Swiss Bank Corporation. The Swiss have this image of being very conservative and old-fashioned. Absolute rubbish. They, when left to their devices, can be absolute pirates. As long as it's legal, they will have a go at it. As long as you're successful, they'll give you room to run. And they run a very interesting sort of a way to run a bank. They have two parallel structures. They have people like Brian, who are like the gunslingers, very well paid, but they're never going to be managing the bank and in administrative. That was a Swiss track. But people like Brian were employed to do certain things or be in charge of certain areas. And he found them very good to deal with. So when he left them, it was 25 years to the day that he joined the city. And the reason he left, he decided to leave before, but then when he announced he was going to leave, he told one of his main clients, which was the Jardine Matheson Group, and they said, Sir Henry said, Brian, have you thought of coming to Hong Kong to live? And then that's how he joined Jardines.
And that's actually one of the quotes that were published when Brian joined Jardines, right? It's like Arsenal signing David Beckham from Manchester United and saying that they hope they will score the occasional goal. So this is a measure of the man. I mean, this is just a sense of the measure of the man that we're talking about.
Well, Brian had actually been doing deals and working with the Keswicks for a dozen years before he joined Jardines. So he'd been been with them quite a long time and knew them as friends as well as clients. So moving to Hong Kong was not a big stretch. And what they wanted him to do in Hong Kong was to internally restructure what the group was and the way it was run, because it had got very wide and a little unwieldy, and it needed to be pruned a little to make sure that capital was allocated to the places where the return would be highest. And he really loved Hong Kong, and he would have stayed there to retirement if he hadn't passed away.
Now, moving on a little bit to the CFDs invention, I understand that this was he worked on a deal for Trafalgar House, and that was the basis.
Yeah. The client there was Jardines again, Hong Kong Land, and they were looking to increase their stake in Trafalgar House and then eventually take it over, which they did. I'm not sure Brian did them a favour, because Trafalgar House later on became an absolute shambles and they lost a lot of money on it, but at least it happened. And then similarly, Trafalgar House took a run at Northern Electric a few years later, again using CFDs as part of the mechanism. That deal did not work, but CFDs were to the fore.
Yes, and like many other instruments in finance, they're sometimes developed for one thing, and then they get a life of their own. And this seems to have been the case with CFDs. I assume that Brian did not intend for CFDs to become what they have become today. But how do you think he would have considered the industry?
Yeah. Well, you've got to remember, Brian was a man of his time, and also of a time when the previous talk was very interesting, because I'm not sure that the regulators of his day would even know what a derivative was. They found out because of Brian and John Wood and CFDs. But I think that at that time it was an undeveloped area completely. Foreign exchange was something that was done in a foreign exchange dealing room in a bank. End of story. Corporates often didn't even have proper treasury departments then. So the world has changed a great deal. So Brian had the luxury of operating in a era when regulation was much looser. And in some ways, Brian and John Wood developed the regulatory environment because the regulators brought the rules in to stop them doing the same thing again. Meanwhile, they were devising what they were going to do next week, which was different. And Brian ended his time, and it stayed on after City, as chairman of the City Disputes Panel. And I asked somebody at his memorial, why did they choose Brian? And the answer was because he caused most of them.
And I understand that. I mean, this was not the only time that he had running with regulation. No. Yeah, I mean, it came up again, time and time again.
He had some famous disputes, including one with Alistair Morton over Eurotunnel.
Yeah, there was another one, I believe, with Barclays.
Minor Barclays. I don't think he ever thought clearing banks were really rivals.
But I understand also that his practices, and because I understand that the CFDs were initially developed, I mean, the way that he at least used it was for acquisitions, right?
Yep.
I also understand that in recent times there have been some other people trying to emulate to some extent, maybe in a different way.
Yeah. One of the advantages of using CFDs in a slightly hostile takeover or state building that isn't really known is because it's under the radar. And, when Brian and John Wood did it the first time round, you didn't have to notify the authorities of a stake. If you actually bought the shares, there was a notifiable amount. If you built the same sort of stake through derivatives, it wasn't notifiable. So that was how they managed to do what they did on that first deal. Now you have to notify if you built a stake through derivatives above a certain stage. But up to that level, and there's been something recently which I think was CFDs, was a stake being built in Comets Bank. A 4.5% stake was built by an Italian bank. And then when the Italian bank bid on the 4.5% being sold by the German state, suddenly they became the second shareholder at 9% to the chagrin of the German establishment.
I'm beginning to become a little bit cautious about the time, so I'd like to ask you, before we close, what was the thing that Brian was most proud about in his career?
Actually, it's what he did at Jardines after he left banking. Is he took what was a very good platform and trimmed it round the edges to redeploy the capital to where it could generate the best returns. You will remember that Jardine Matheson, although it's very big, is at its roots a family business. Therefore, raising external capital is something that they can't really do. There's a lot of capital, but it's not infinite. Therefore, they have to decide which of their businesses are growth and which ones are not, and trim accordingly.
So, what do you think Brian's key to success was?
I think in doing what he did and still having fun. You know, he had a life outside banking, a very rich life. He sailed, played golf, played cricket, loved music, opera in particular. So he was not somebody confined to the bank. And he would advise everybody here, while you're in a place like Bangkok or visiting somewhere else, make some time to go out and see the place, enjoy the place, please.
Thank you, Rory. And as I said before, when we began, there's not enough time to discuss a lot of things that Brian has achieved during his lifetime. However, for anybody that is interested, Rory is going to be with us at booth number 2. So if you can convince him to share some more stories, you're welcome to. And I know that the things that Rory is not sharing right now are probably the most fascinating things, okay? But I'm sure that he might be able to open up a little bit more if you approach him later. I think that, I understand that there's going to be a question. Yes? Go ahead. Yes. Could you?
I've noticed that you've been working in Abu Dhabi for quite long, right? And I came from Abu Dhabi. So you're working in IT, right? I just want to know, how do you see the UAE trend in terms of attracting business and capital? And what makes the UAE different from other countries like Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Pakistan?
Well, I think it's that.
The more.
I think what makes the UAE different, it may not be very fashionable, is the fact that it is run by royal families. And the regulators do what they do, but they're not allowed to prevent business. They're there to encourage business. It was a wonderful place to work. I hate the traffic these days, and I go back a lot because I've got a lot of friends left there, etc. It's a wonderful place to do business. And I think you're going to see them being very happy with Mr. Starmer and Rachel Richardson in the British government, because they're about to produce an awful lot of new immigrants with a lot of money coming to the UAE, as they're not welcome in the UK anymore.
Well, I'm afraid I've just been notified that we ran out of time. So thank you, Rory. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Thank you for being here. As I said, you know, if anybody wants to ask some more questions, we're going to be at booth number 2. Thank you very much.